Hello, welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. Today's a very exciting day because I actually get to interview somebody who is themselves the host of their own successful procurement podcast, namely Martin Smith. Martin is the host of the Talent Talks podcast, where he interviews procurement professionals from across industries. If you haven't, absolutely recommend that for a listen. Martin has an extensive background specializing in procurement and supply chain recruitment across all industries. He's been doing that for about 14 years now, and he's the founder and managing director of Talent Drive, which he set up in May 2019 and focuses in a mixture of recruitment agency and in-house recruitment roles across procurement and supply chain. So Martin, this is slightly odd for me, right? I've never previously interviewed someone who is themselves a host.
You've really put up the guest there. Thank you for that. I didn't pay you to say that, but no, appreciate that. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I guess this must be a bit weird for you, like being on the other end of the questions rather than
Yeah, I know, right? I normally I guess you prepare and sort of have those sort of two-way conversation anyway. But no, it's nice to be on this side of the fence. Less pressure, right? I can just sit here and see what comes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm feeling the pressure now because you're a professional, so it'll be really obvious if I'm no good at it. Martin, so podcasting aside, the thing you're obviously very renowned for in our industry is recruitment. I mean, you've been in this space a long time. For those who are regular listeners, you'll know we previously recorded a podcast with Lucy Harding talking about how to get the next CPO role. So to avoid perhaps covering too much of the same ground, I was really interested to get your kind of expertise and perspective on perhaps people newer into the industry, newer into their roles in procurement. And there's lots I think I'd like to unpack in that. I guess we should probably start with the cliche, which I hear a lot, I'm sure you hear a lot, in that procurement has an image problem, right? And as a cliche is young people don't necessarily want to work in procurement or don't understand procurement. Is that a cliche? Is that fair? Do you see that in your day-to-day work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And yes, the simple answer is I do. I think a lot of it comes down to the PR and the marketing behind actually procurement as a profession. If you literally Google procurement degrees and things, you've got a lot of archaic language there around purchasing and commodity management. And there's a lot of integration with sort of the supply chain logistics aspect as well, which can be confusing. But I think procurement still has a little bit of a stigma for undergraduates and people that are kind of entry into the profession of actually what is it actually that people do. And it's sometimes often a bit of an afterthought on accountancy and finance degree or other sort of academic qualifications where procurement's a bit of a side module or sub-module within that degree, which is obviously disappointing. And I think it still has a long way to go. I think it's grown. I think it's definitely, as a degree, an undergraduate degree, it's definitely improved, but I think there's a long way to go still. And again, it comes back to the PR and the marketing behind it and the language used, I think definitely needs modernizing.
Yeah. And so, Martin, I guess certainly in your role now, I guess in roles you've had previously, part of your job has been talking to people early in their career. How do you go about rectifying that kind of brand image? And what is it that those people you speak to, what is their perception of procurement? I mean, is it nothing? Is it wrong?
Well, I was lucky enough when I was at Coca-Cola, when I was sort of the TA manager there, I was lucky to be part of supporting our graduate program. So every year we hired 3 graduates into the UK finance department, which was where procurement sat. And actually, interestingly, if I look at those 3 people, when they joined, they put procurement as part of the rotation program for, I think it was around about 6-month period. And the 2 individuals that I was sort of supporting in recruiting in, both absolutely loved it. And I think the big sell, once people get into procurement, the retention actually in procurement as a profession is amazing. It's well above market rate. I think it's something like 85% of people that start in procurement as a graduate remain in the profession, or at least some guys within a kind of commercial role, which is an amazing statistic. So actually, it's once you get the foot in the door, you and I both know the exposure you get as a procurement professional across all departments and areas is brilliant. And that's what I experienced there. But yeah, certainly going to the graduate fairs, and when I was discussing kind of the finance programs, clearly they understood that. There's also the supply chain element of it, which was more well known, but procurement wasn't at all. So, a lot of the role, I guess, for me was educating them. And selfishly, obviously, with my background in procurement recruitment, I was saying, hey, if you go on the finance degree, you'll get a chance to get involved in procurement, and that'd be a really fun part to do. But yeah, certainly a lot of people aren't aware of it. And even now, when I'm telling friends and family and people, in life that I meet, and I say I'm in recruitment and they ask what I do, and I say, oh, I'm doing procurement, they sort of often look at me. I'm sure you have that as well, Simon. They look at me a bit blank going, what's that? And I have different remarks, but I guess I just say it's people that buy stuff for companies. Yeah. I don't know what you tend to phrase it when people ask you what you do, but
25 years in, I'm still not totally sure my wife understands what it is I do, right? So in your roles, when you're talking to people, what's your elevator pitch, if you like? What's the 2 or 3 minute pitch as to how you get somebody excited in procurement? Because you and I know it's a very exciting industry. It has all kinds of opportunities and potential. But how do you sum that up into someone who perhaps has no concept of even what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, sure. I think the wonderful thing about procurement is, and you know this, you get to work from all aspects, both looking at the kind of EQ and IQ side of how you kind of use your brain, essentially. You've got the numerical, the number crunching, the data, looking at things around the sort of supply risk management and making sure that part of the role. You've got the commercial, the sales side of things going out there. Maybe it's winning bids, winning new work into the organization. And then, of course, you've got the whole negotiation and trading variables with people, both internally and externally. So, and that's full exposure across HR, IT, the facilities department, legal. It covers every aspect of business. So you generally, as a procurement professional, get that full exposure to every area of business. And then what you see over time, people evolve. They'll start becoming maybe category specialists, or they might hone in on the SRM, or move into the advisory and consultancy world, which is obviously the world that you're in now. So you've got so many different aspects to do, and it's just a wonderful training ground for people that are coming out of university, rather than sometimes you see people getting sort of into a sort of a narrow corner of a profession, which you don't get in procurement. So something like that, I guess, is what I would do. And actually, interestingly, there's parallels between kind of how I got into recruitment and how often people get into procurement. You do tend to fall into it. When I have people come onto the Talent Talks podcast, there's very few people, probably can count on one hand how many people say, oh, I was there as a 12-year-old thinking I wanted to do procurement when I'm older, or whatever, when they're doing their degree. Not at all. People fall into it. They do, other angles. They'll maybe do a diploma in something else, and then they fall into it during their time. I've had quite a lot of recruiters in our space, actually, interestingly, then go into procurement. So, and it's the same with recruiters, right? I wasn't sat there doing my A-levels thinking I wanted to be specializing in procurement recruitment, and I love it, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't something I necessarily had to do, and you do sort of fall into it. So I guess going back to your earlier point, it's about trying to get people to actually proactively want to go into the profession rather than just falling into it down the line in their career.
From your vantage point, how do you see that changing? Because I've been in a fair amount of time. I'm sure you have as well. I don't get the sense that brand problem is really, it's probably got better, but I still feel like it's got a long way to go. Is it on companies to be articulating that benefit? Is it on some of our industry bodies to be doing it? Is it job of recruiters like yourselves, us as consultants? How can we as an industry try to rectify, because it feels like it's in all our interest to do that, right?
Yeah, I'd say it's a collective effort. I mean, I think certainly if I look about the governing body, particularly with SIPs, obviously a lot of the degrees are accredited by SIPs and supported by them. But I think with those guys, I would suggesting some of the language needs to be a bit more modernized around that, which is a point we made earlier. I think in terms of organizations, I think they need to make more commitment to actually investing in graduate programs for people. And indeed, when we talk about graduates here, but maybe people that perhaps aren't gone down the university route, and maybe they're doing college diplomas or other aspects out of their A-levels. It shouldn't just be wedded to people that are working in come out of a university. So I would be saying that the talent pool should be widened as well. And I think that will really, really help. But organizations making that commitment. But I see myself, yes, of course, I recruit in the profession, but like you, I see myself as kind of a brand ambassador and waving the flag and trying to get people into doing it. To be honest, that's why I did the podcast. It was to elevate the profession and raise the profile of it. So I think that's really, really important. But a collective effort, it's definitely improving. And there's definitely been a step change in the sort of 14, 15 years of me recruiting in the profession. I've definitely seen an improvement, but I think there still needs to be a lot more to be done, both by organizations and indeed, us and governing bodies.
Yeah. One of the other cliches I hear a lot, Martin, I was really interested to get your perspective on, is that the younger generation of talent, if you like, the ESG agenda, the social value agenda, business doing good, is an opportunity to attract talent. Again, is that a cliche, or do you actually see that when you talk to younger people? Do they recognize how procurement can have a real impact in that space?
No, it's a really good point, actually. And I think when I was thinking about then saying of actually the kind of ways we get people into it, I think playing on that ESG agenda is massive, actually, for the next generation. I think the exciting thing about people now that are sort of coming into their first job is they're very conscious around society. They're very conscious around sustainable sourcing. And actually, when we start talking about sustainable sourcing, that's language that we've seen in the market. And then people actually resonate, like, oh yeah, I've seen an article about, sustainable sourcing that a supermarket might have done or something. So actually playing on that is really interesting. But yeah, I think the next generation, as we maybe want to refer to them as, it's green energy. It's as I say, it's that wider diversity and inclusion. Are businesses inclusive? When I've interviewed people for us that have joined, and people that are younger and high energy coming into our organization, that's what they want to know. What is your diversity and inclusion policy? What is your What is your sustainability agenda? How are you guys, going towards the carbon net zero pledge? What is your commitment to that? And that's the bit that procurement are doing an amazing job of putting their arms around and really running with. And that's definitely an angle I can see to getting people into the profession, and actually the sustainable kind of mission. And we know about a lot of the initiatives going on in the market at the moment. Playing on that and getting people involved in that, I think, is something that is light at the end of the tunnel, I think. And I think that's a really good angle to pull people and attract people into the profession.
Yeah. Martin, one of the other things I'm really interested. So you recruit across all levels, I think, in terms of procurement seniority and industries and other things. If I was listening to this podcast and I was a procurement professional, maybe first or second year in a kind of procurement role, so very, very new to the world, and I was looking forward in terms of managing my career, and I love procurement, and that's the direction I'm fairly sure I want to continue in, what kind of advice would you give them? What are the areas they should be thinking about? What are the skills they should be considering? How should they build that CV that when it lands on your desk in 5 or 10 years' time, you're going, yeah, that looks like a phenomenal person?
So I think push yourself. And by that, I always talk to candidates around diversifying the sort of category areas and the exposure of industry sectors that they work in. I think if you've worked in modern procurement, I think if you worked in the same sector, in the same category for 30 plus years, I think it really narrows your opportunity. So I think you want to set yourself up at the earlier part of your career to broaden and challenge yourself and try different category areas, whether that's, if you've done a lot of work in corporate services, maybe broadening into technology or vice versa. Yeah. So I think someone that can kind of demonstrate being a true generalist and being adaptable to different areas and industry sectors, I think is my kind of number one piece of advice for people. Sometimes don't be afraid to make a sideways move if it's going to step you up in your career. You're never going to have a perfect CV where they're a buyer for 4 years, then a senior buyer, then a manager, then a cat man, et cetera, et cetera. You might be lucky and that might happen, but ultimately, I think some of the sort of best CPOs that I've been lucky enough to interact with have had to take some sideways moves on the way because they see some longer term growth and opportunity. So don't be afraid to sometimes take those risks, back yourself, and sometimes make that move into a more progressive organization that maybe have passions for areas where maybe it is the ESG agenda, but something that you're passionate about as well, that you can kind of help and develop. I think people are often scared around, the job title of that role is not quite reflecting on where I am now. If you can tell the right story and you've got the right sort of accountability behind you and it feels right for you, then I think go for it. And my final third thing, just while I'm thinking about it, is also don't be obsessed about the spend that you're going to be accountable for. It's much around what you do with it. So I think sometimes people get fixated on, I'm managing a 400 million spent at the moment. It must be at least 500 and it must be global. Well, actually, you should always look at actually, what are you doing with that money? How are you adding value rather than just I'm managing this and I'm renegotiating some contracts every year? Think around the value add bit.
Martin, this is actually a question I asked Lisa. I'm always fascinated when I talk to individuals like yourself. You must have interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of procurement professionals over your career. I'm really intrigued as to how quickly you kind of can come to a sense of an individual that you've not met before as, they're really good or they're not so good, and what it is, how you do that, right?
Oh, that's a good question. Give away the trade secrets. I mean, quite quickly. I mean, I think you know yourself as an experienced procurement leader, quite quickly, whatever the profession, if someone's going to be a placeable candidate, I guess, in our world. Yeah, I would say within sort of 3 to 5 minutes. The main areas that you can kind of really gauge from that is candidates being succinct. They actually know their CV, they know what they're doing, and they'll be able to give you quite a punchy, I've done this, this, and this, and this is where I am today. And they've got that kind of self-awareness that they can kind of be punchy about it, but without being too sort of direct with you. I think that's a sign of someone that's generally a good candidate or someone that you think you can place. And obviously what's coming more important now, we mentioned earlier, is that sort of emotional intelligence piece as well. If someone's got the soft skills now are so important in procurement. You guys aren't just robots there firing out numbers. You need personality. You need to be able to engage with the C-suite and flex your comm style depending on which stakeholder you're working with. I think it's such an important skill. So that is, the behaviors of individuals is very much something that we kind of look for as well.
Martin, just out of interest, in a world of increasing AI capability, we hear about it almost daily, that these AI solutions are becoming more and more sophisticated. If you were to wind the clock forward maybe 5 or 10 years, in that context, do you see the requirements of procurement professionals being the EQ and the IQ, the technical ability, if you like, and the emotional ability, both staying of equal importance? Or do you actually see a world where some of that technology means that the EQ becomes the commodity that's really valuable?
Yeah, I would say the latter. I would definitely say the EQ is going to become more important. And I think maybe some of the more sort of tactical, transactional sort of activity will absolutely be outsourced to robots or, whatever technology we're going to be sort of carrying on develop. It's scary, the rate, as I'm sure you're seeing, the rate that that's developing. I think procurement professionals 5-10 years time is very much going to be around sort of setting the strategy and really sort of positioning that to the C-suite rather than necessarily doing some of the doing. You still need to be in front of a desk sometimes and be in front of the table to negotiate with your suppliers. I think that human side of it, I think, is really important. That's my belief. I know people have different views on that, but I think some of the more low value transactional type renegotiating contract stuff, I do think will be automated more and more. So like I say, I think that more strategic, high value type stuff will be still needed by procurement leaders and probably be more important.
One other thing I was really interested to discuss with you, I mentioned it a couple of times in previous podcasts. You obviously are an entrepreneur yourself, right? You reached a point in, I think, 2019 where you said, right, I'm gonna start Talent Talks. I'm gonna go out on my own. I'm just really intrigued. Why was that? What took you to that point? It's not a common thing, right? There's a degree of focus there that's not that common, right?
Yeah. Especially when a pandemic then hit 8 months into launching the business was fun. But yeah, I think it's something I've always wanted to do. You know, I've been really lucky. I've worked for two fantastic recruitment agency leaders that taught me a lot. You know, I work for great people that I learned a lot from. And I think if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have had the confidence to go and set up on my own. So, you know, I can only thank them and I think give that genuine confidence. As I say, it's something I've always had in me. I guess that sounds a bit naff, that entrepreneurial spirit. I don't know what you want to call it, but just felt that I could sort of do it and do something different. I think also, you know, for me, I felt there was a bit of a gap in the market in terms of our approach and maybe my style and knowledge and network and things that I could do stuff differently. The podcast being one thing that hadn't been done before, and it's been a wonderful kind of USP for us as an organization to help us be real thought leaders. I think one of the main things when I set up Talent Drive, I didn't just want to be a transaction recruitment agency. I wanted to be a thought leader. I kind of feel like a bit imposter syndrome sometimes as a procurement professional. I don't proclaim to be, but you know, I know the market, I understand the kind of product I'm working with, and I'm really passionate about that. So I think that's one thing that I'm really sort of, I guess, trying to translate to the audience that I have. So but yeah, that's the probably reasons why I guess I did it.
Really interesting. Martin, you've been very kind to help me take on a number of cliches, and probably my last one, I'll give you one more and you can give me your perspective on this. The other thing I think I've heard many times is procurement people aren't entrepreneurial enough. You know, they're not talking the right language for the business. What's your perspective on that? I'd love to get your take.
No, I disagree. Every great procurement person that I work with is entrepreneurial. You don't need to run your own business and physically have your own company. And trust me, there are days where I'm like, whoa, this is a tough gig and maybe I could just go back to a paid employment. But no, I would totally disagree with that remark. You know, at the end of the day, if you're a procurement leader in an organization, you've got an enormous responsibility, both not just in terms of spend, but in terms of the team, in terms of remit. And there's so many aspects that procurement are driving now across any organization, whether it's, you know, looking at the risk management side of things, looking at the actual sourcing of products, whether it's, as I say, it's the team side of things. It just covers every aspect. So you need to be entrepreneurial to be able to be involved in that type. And you're making big decisions for organization, which is going to impact bottom line profit. So isn't that what any entrepreneur does? Isn't that what, you know, I'm trying to do? It's about being profitable and sustainable as an organization, and procurement absolutely are leading the forefront in most organizations. So no, I definitely dispute that.
Good. Martin, a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today. Really interesting to get your perspective on the industry, to get your view on a number of those cliches that keep coming up and up. So that's really interesting. For listeners, absolutely check out Martin's podcast, Talent Talks, on all good platforms, I'm sure, Martin. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It was a real privilege to have you on the podcast.
No, thank you so much for having me, Simon. Hopefully there wasn't too many cliches my end.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, take care. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.